welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zach.
And today we are talking about story shapes. So story shapes were originally introduced by Vonnegut, he gave a lecture on the shape of story. You can find it on YouTube, and we'll have the link in the description. And it was originally his master's thesis for his anthropology degree, but he was rejected. Nonetheless, he called it his prettiest contribution to society. So he was very proud of these, and I really like them. I think they're fun to play with. So let's talk about Vonnegut's story shapes.
Yeah, so when we're talking about story shapes, the thing to think about is that you're trying to map the predominant emotional feeling of the story into a graphical form. So along the x-axis, you're going to have the time. So closer to 0 is going to be the beginning of the book, and then you move towards the end of the book as you move to the right on the axis. And then the y-axis is good or bad fortune. So you have good fortune at the top, bad fortune at the bottom. When good things are happening, you have positive values, and then when bad things are happening, you have negative values. This was an idea that Vonnegut was just using back when he presented it. But since then, we have gotten a lot better at using computers in order to crunch text. And we've also been able to develop what's called natural language processing, which is a form of artificial intelligence, and it's part of what is driving the current innovations inside of artificial intelligence more generally. And using these natural language processing techniques, specifically sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis is a technique where you're looking at the emotional connotations of words and you're quantifying them. So you're saying this word has an emotional connotation, a positive emotional connotation of like 70%, and this one has one of 40%, and then this one has negative 40%, that kind of thing. And so you run through the story, you tally up all of the sentiment analysis as you go through the story, and then you plot it. That was what scientists did back in 2014. When they did it, they cranked out 6 basic plots. And there's a lot of overlap in between what Vonnegut originally proposed inside of his master's thesis and the results of these experiments.
Awesome. So you can think of, we'll go into the 6 basic plots of the scientists found testing Vonnegut story shapes in a second, but you can string these stories together to make longer plots, so you can have multiple story shapes in one novel, and you can embed these stories within larger frameworks. So you could theoretically use like one of these story shapes in a different plot structure, like Save the Cat or The Hero's Journey. And just know that both of these strategies are ways of embracing the episodic nature of writing a novel rather than focusing on a cinematic quality. So instead of thinking of it as a feature film like Save the Cat or this Pixar Story Spine might, it's more episodic and it's a little bit more just built for novels than it is for film.
Yeah, so let's talk about the story shapes. The first one is rags to riches. You start out with these negative feelings, negative sentiments, and then through hard work and determination, the main character moves into the positive space where good things are happening. You can also run it in reverse, where you have the riches to rags story, where things start out good and then they end poorly.
Yeah. So, and then the cut that in half and mirror it is The Man in a Hole, where the main character starts out with everything they want, lose it all, and then gain it back. So it's riches to rags to riches. I suppose you could also go the other way for riches to rags to riches to rags.
Yes, and that is the next story structure on the list.
You're right. I didn't even look at the next note. I was like, oh, cool. I can figure stuff out, and it's just in fact the next thing in the notes I read 15 minutes ago. Perfect. And so the first one I mentioned was Man in a Hole. The second one is called the Icarus story structure. If you're familiar with the Greek myth of Icarus, he has everything, or he has nothing, gets the wings, and then is hubris filled and falls into the sea because his wax wings melt. Sad times. Zach, do you want to do our last two?
Yeah, continuing the theme of sad Greek myths, let's talk about the Oedipus structure. The main character starts out at the top of the world, has something go wrong, they return from that, and then everything goes wrong again. So if you are familiar with the story of Oedipus, Oedipus starts out as, if I'm remembering correctly, because it's been like 8 years since I've actually read Oedipus, but he starts out as royalty. He finds out that there's this curse on the land, and he's trying to figure out what's going on with the curse. He figures out that why the curse is happening, but it turns out the reason why is because he murdered his father and married his mother. So he gouges out his eyes and wanders around as a blind beggar for the rest of the story. And his wife/mother kills herself. So it's a really bleak story.
Yeah, definitely tragedy.
Yeah, but if you read the sequels, there's some interesting stuff going on there. Random plug for a 2,500-year-old play called Oedipus at Colonus.
I didn't even know there were sequels. This is wild. I'm learning new things.
There are 2 sequels, and one of them is about Oedipus's daughter/sister because of the whole incest thing. Anyway.
Yeah. Good to know.
Then you have the Cinderella structure. And the Cinderella structure is you take the Oedipus structure and you just flip it around. So the main character starts out in poor spirits. They work really hard to get what they want. They lose it. And then they get it back at the end. If you're familiar with the Disney version of Cinderella, she starts out poor. She works really hard to get the dress. The dress gets torn up. Then
fairy godmother fixes it.
The fairy godmother shows up. And then she lives happily ever after with the prince. These are the 6 shapes that these researchers found inside of the sentiment analysis of the corpus of works that they were looking at. And they're pretty similar to the ones that Vonnegut talked about. Rin, do you want to briefly talk about the differences in between those 2 sets of story shapes?
Yeah, so Vonnegut in his lectures on YouTube has 8, and I can link in the show notes a diagram by Maya Ilem that illustrates these really well, because Vonnegut draws on a chalkboard, but he draws I think multiple on the same chalkboard, and it's not lasting. But here's a lasting graphic for you. There's Man in Hole, which we've already talked about. There's Cinderella, which we already talked about. One of his story structures was the Old Testament, the New Testament, which is identical to Cinderella. Just a different framing of it, which shows you how different different stories can be with the same structure. That's 3 of them. There's the Old Testament, where humankind receives incremental gifts from a deity, but suddenly ousted from good standing in a fall of enormous proportions. That's also not only Old Testament, but Great Expectations. You have the creation story, which is just things incrementally getting better with no fall after it. There's Boy Meets Girl, which is main character comes across something wonderful, gets it, loses it, then gets it back forever, which is actually one of the ones we already talked about. You get something, lose something, get back together. That's that's very similar to Man in a Hole. Yes, yep. Boy Meets Girl and Man in a Hole are the same thing. I'm looking at the diagrams and I should be able to know this. I'm just I'm going out of order on the diagram. It's really rough. Bad to worse. Think of the Metamorphosis by Kafka. It just gets bad and just does not ever get better. Then there's Which Way Is Up. Train wreck. Yeah, just a whole train wreck. Which Way Is Up, where it has life ambiguity. I think of Hamlet, and so does Vonnegut. He talks about how Hamlet's things are not really good, but not really bad either, and you're not really sure what's going on. And is that ghost really his dad, or was it a demon impersonating his dad? We don't know. So, and similar to that Hamlet story, one of the cons of it is nothing will perfectly plot to a story shape. There's always gonna be different inflections in the graph.
Yep.
So much and another likewise the story shapes are just not specific. So sometimes it can be really hard to figure out which one your story exactly is. Because they don't plot perfectly. But then there's also prose to this one, which I think are fun because Zach, do you want to take us with the prose?
Yeah, I think one of the big things about the story shapes is that they're pretty widely applicable and they help scratch that itch of humans really liking patterns. One of the reasons why I like the story shapes is because they're like fractals. So you could structure your novel as a rags to riches story, but as you're going through, you can say, you know what? I want Act One to be I want it to be an Icarus story. I want Act Two to be an Oedipus story, and then I want Act Three to be a Cinderella story. Um, like you can string them together and lay them on top of other story shapes in order to create more varied um, plots. They're also really useful for plotting out individual scenes. So if you were really struggling with figuring out, I don't know what is supposed to happen inside of the scene, I don't know how to make it interesting, think about using a story shape. Are you moving from a positive value to a negative value? Are you moving from a negative value to a positive value? Or are you doing some more weird stuff in the middle? Those are all, those shapes are things that you can use inside of your scenes to explore what is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've said everything I want to say about story shapes. Have you?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, in that case, this was story shapes, and this is what we didn't say this at the beginning, but this is actually our last episode of story structures. Woohoo! We went through like 12. That was a lot. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for coming along on the journey. If you have a story structure that we didn't talk about that you want us to talk about, you should send us an email. Our email is quidprosquo@gmail.com. Just the title of the show at gmail.com. We will see you back next week for more fun and exciting things. And also, we are coming up on our 100th episode. So if you have ideas of what we should do to celebrate, email those to us too. Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day. This has been Quid Pros Quo.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and ZK Jensen. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a rating. And if you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. For more episodes, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts.